Hello there. Today's video isn't really one of the proper Q&A session that we've been doing at the moment, although I think there was, I can't remember if it was one of the actual questions or in the comment session asking about the Spartacus TV series. Well, we're not talking about that today. We're going to try and talk about the historical Spartacus, have a look at the evidence that exists, try and say a little bit about what's going on in this period and the context of it all. Now, ages and ages ago, it may even have been the first on-screen thing I did about history. We looked at the old Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis, Laurence Olivier, Peter Ustinov, Gene Simmons, that terrific cast of that old epic Spartacus. And people, in many respects, probably come to the story through that more than anything else, ever since that was made, based on the Howard Fast novel. Back then, I think I remember promising that I would look at the history at some point, but there hasn't really been time to do that, and it's cropped up, and because I've been doing a little bit of work related to this for some fiction rather than for non-fiction, I thought this would make sense. It's an interesting thing. It's one of those topics, again, we know the name, we have the basic facts of the story, the basic points of the escape of these gladiators, the rebellion, the formation of the great slave army, the victories they win, but the ultimate defeat and the mass crucifixion along the Appian Way, or Via Latina, depending on which interpretation you follow. So today we're talking about the history. Just for those who've asked about the Spartacus television series, I'm not sure whether I can bring myself to sit through it again. I did when it was first available on any of the channels I had, on the basis that if they make anything about the Roman period, I almost feel obliged to watch it, because I can't help feeling that at some lecture or other or session I do somewhere, someone will ask a question, did this happen or did that happen? And if I've seen that it's something made up for a TV series or for a movie, then at least I can say, no, that's I Claudius or that's Spartacus or whatever it might be. So I sat through it, and it seemed to go on for ages. They did rather pad it out, and then wasn't there a prequel series? I think there was a tragic death of the main lead actor and all this sort of thing. I believe there's another series, a spin-off coming out. I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to be, presumably a prequel. But I don't quite know where they're fitting all that in, or whether they're just using the Spartacus name. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I can't promise to do that one because it was heavy going. It was so lurid in the way, and that strange sort of rather cartoony look it had, I found a bit odd. It was a bit like 300, I suppose. But the dialogue was so repetitive and limited in the vocabulary involved, and you'd embellish things so much, and it was all a bit surreal, the levels of violence, people having faces sliced off and all this sort of thing, and lots of this blood squirting everywhere. It didn't really make any firm attempt to show gladiatorial fights as they really were, or anything that much. I mean, there were moments in it, I suppose. You showed the Decimation there, they rather overdid that. We'll talk about that historically in a moment. But it just seemed a bit sex and violence. So I remember when a graduate student was telling me, and she said, I hadn't seen this at a conference, she was saying, oh, well, just think of it as softcore pornography with some violence thrown in. And I guess that's probably it. I'm not really an expert on the rating of these things. Lucy Lawless is a strapping lass. It was nice to see her without much on and all this sort of thing, or with nothing on in most cases. But really, it was all a little bit lowest common denominator. On the other hand, it's got its fans, and if those fans go on to develop an interest in the ancient world and the Romans, then, good on them. And good for the series for doing that. But I don't think there's really enough history in it. I think there's even a fictional son of Crassus, isn't there? There's all sorts of odd stuff in it. I don't think it's Publius, it's somebody else, or Marcus. I think they had somebody else as this rather weaselly character of dubious morals and courage and all this sort of thing. It's and there are too many people you realise, you say, oh yes, I've seen that actress in that, and I think, oh yeah, when they prop up in something more serious and less racy. So I can't promise. I suspect I won't do it because it would take a long time to sit through and watch it all again. It's years since I saw it, and I'm not sure I can remember that much to do it justice. So that's the aside. But today we're not talking about the on-screen in any direct way, though I will use a couple of stills from the Spartacus movie because I've got them and it's rather fun. We're going to talk about the history itself. So we're dealing with the slave rebellion that took place in 73 BC, was suppressed in 71 BC. It's the largest, by far the most significant slave rebellion ever to occur in Roman Italy. There are others, but they're very small scale, never really gets going. This is something where the army is credited with being certainly tens of thousands, perhaps over 100,000 or more, even 250,000. Figures may well be exaggerated, but this is really big, and it lasts 3 years with the army, the slave army, doing pretty much what it wants to do for much of the time. There have been two big slave rebellions in Sicily in the 2nd century BC, one almost at the very end of the century, but there hasn't been something like that in Italy. So this is unique, really, in the scale that the slaves in Sicily never quite develop an army on the scale of the one in Italy. They don't inflict defeats on proper Roman armies in the way that Spartacus and the rebels will. So this is something very unusual, very distinctive, and it deserves explanation. Because after all, slavery is a major component of Roman society. During the course of the 2nd century BC, huge numbers of slaves flood onto the market and flood into Italy, and this is the whole pattern. And it's the background to the Gracchian concerns over the land. And by the way, I have seen the question about the Gracchi and Rosenstein's ideas and all this sort of thing. I will get round to doing a video on those, but I haven't had the time to do it yet. That whole question, where I think it comes down to a matter of degree. There's something worth saying at the moment. The idea you get from the sources, from Plutarch, from the actions of the Gracchi, the fragments of their speeches, is that there was a huge, major drop in the number of Roman citizens, freeborn people who owned their own farms and were able to support their families, and they themselves went off and served in the legions when required, and their sons went on and did so, and all this thing. The bedrock of the Roman army, the sort of yeoman farmer, that these are being squeezed out by the big estates, the big latifundia, where men get rich through the profits of overseas expansion. Again, this is the sort of thing we've talked about fairly briefly. We've given an overview of this in the Conquered and the Proud lecture series, so you want more on this, go back to the early ones of those lectures. And they buy up big estates, or in some cases rent them from publicly owned land. So the state owned quite a lot of territory it had acquired during the conquest period, and then more recently during the Second Punic War, when there have been confiscations from communities that have sided with Hannibal. So large chunks of Italy was state-owned. It was much easier for big investors to take these on, particularly if you knew the right people and the ones who were making the decisions over who was allowed to do this, rather than divided up into lots of plots of small farms where the individuals would have to be asked and would have to pay you the rent for it regularly. It's harder to collect, it's easier to deal with big players in the market. They buy up lots of land. They also buy up lots of slaves as the labour force, because again, all these people are coming on the market. There's frequent warfare in the West, sometimes in Africa, there's war in the East, and there's also the disruption of the balance of power between the Hellenistic states like the Ptolemies, Macedonians, the Seleucids, and those sort of lesser but still significant powers like Rhodes, like Pergamon, that have maintained fleets and have been able to police the Mediterranean. As they get weaker, as they break down, of course, part because the Romans are pushing them, you end up with a spread of piracy that leads to lots of kidnappings, lots of attacks, so more people are coming onto the market as slaves. So slave labour force becomes a very cheap option. And if you look at Cato's book on agriculture, written in the 2nd century BC, the assumption is your labour force will be overwhelmingly servile. These will be people you own rather than people you hire. You might supplement them with seasonal labour for the really big tasks, but basically you're dealing with a villicus, the slave manager, who runs the estate for you, and then the slave workforce of various degrees. And you get this in Columella, you get it in Varro, the same idea later on, that you have slaves of different grades, some are given privileges, they're, so the most harshly treated are chained up at night in a sort of prison on the estate. Others get to live in houses, in huts, in accommodation. Some are allowed to have families, marry effectively, even if not in a technical legal sense. Others just get the opportunity to visit female slaves at certain times as a privilege, as a reward, all this sort of thing. And it's all about managing estates where the assumption is that you are dealing with slave labor. So the numbers are huge. I mean, the Aemilius Paulus is supposed to enslave, I think it's 150,000 people in one day at Epirus. Now, we have to be a little bit careful with these numbers, because sometimes enslaving people is basically a form of extortion. You declare them all slaves, and then you rely upon their relatives, their family, to come and bail them out, basically to buy back their freedom. So it's a very good way of squeezing people for money that would be much harder to get otherwise. But it does sometimes mean that you're a slave for a brief period. Your freedom is purchased. You've lost a lot of money, a lot of property, but you're still free. You are not shipped off and sold on the market. On the other hand, lots of people do suffer that fate, and slaves are very common and become more so. It affects the type of agriculture. Obviously, the big estates, it's not primarily growing stuff that you will consume or then barter trade locally for the other things you need. You are farming to produce a very large surplus which you will sell at a profit. It's all about market forces and this sort of thing. Again, these are big issues. We can talk about agriculture and economy and all that sort of thing on other days, because everything you say, as so often is the case, you could say, well, yeah, I've got to qualify that, or it's a little bit more complicated and all this sort of thing. So you've got a world where there are lots of slaves. There are lots of slaves in Italy, particularly in the south, but where you have a lot of the big cattle raising estates, a lot of the big ranches and this sort of thing, where it's livestock is your main thing. You need space. And then you have the slaves who look after the herds are given considerable freedom. You know, they go out on their own, they camp out at night, they have women with them to cook for them, look after them, all this sort of thing. You have concerns later on, by Caesar, for instance, that there are too many people like that and that they're a source of instability. Remember, Caesar lived through the Spartacus rebellion and may well have served during it. So the context is that an awful lot of slaves are there in Italy, and an awful lot of them work on estates where you have absentee landlords, because people invest in more than one estate. Maybe there's a nice villa, big luxury country house that they come to now and again, but a lot of the time you don't see the owners. Now, the Roman tradition had always been much more lavish in granting freedom than just about any other system of slavery in world history, but particularly by ancient standards. And that was much easier when you were the slave who worked alongside the owner of a small farm, because you knew each other. It was also much easier if you were a household slave. Again, you had a more comfortable life in certain ways, but you were an individual. You were more likely to win the favour of your owner, or even be allowed to trade, run a shop, do a craft, this sort of thing, profit from that, and work your way to freedom, buy your way to freedom. For the labourers on one of these big estates, that was all far less likely. So the odds were that you would work as a slave and die as a slave, and that if you had any children, they would be born into slavery and they would labour for someone else all their life as slaves. So that meant it's a different pattern to the traditional one where you've had people who've gone off and become, their children might become very successful because you free a slave, he gets citizenship. Yes, as a freedman, a libertus, or freedwoman, liberta, there are some restrictions on what they can do, but that stops with the next generation. Even though there is the element of stigma, people will accuse someone that they had, as they did with the Caesar Augustus, that there were slaves amongst his ancestors and all this sort of thing. Yes, there could be some snob value, some hostility to it, but nevertheless, an awful lot of people go off and their descendants become very, very successful indeed. So the Romans were far more open than, say, democratic Athens, or indeed, as I say, anywhere in the ancient world. So there are lots of slaves around. Now let's look at the sources before we come on to look at gladiators. Oh, and we've done that at the start. I was just going to say the image I had at the start, and the one that'll be the thumbnail of this, is my son dressed as a gladiator. I'd recommend this if anybody's in the area of the Roman Legionary Museum at Caelian in South Wales during the time of a school holiday. And if you've got kids, have a look out, because they sometimes run these gladiator training days, or gladiator school days, and they're fabulous. It's only an hour or so, but they give a great talk, they show lots of kit, equipment, they get to try on helmets, weapons, all this sort of thing, and then do some training and spar and all this sort of thing. They loved it. But that's why you have the slightly incongruous Mandalorian top, so a different type of helmet, and then the Murmillo's helmet. But I thought, YouTube isn't going to mind this sort of thing, because after all, you can't see who it is within there. And he did enjoy himself. He quite liked the moment of fame. So let's look at the rebellion, and let's look at the sources for it. That's what we come back to time and time again when we look at anything in the ancient world, is how do we know and what do we don't know? I should, of course, have said what we don't know rather than whatever garbled gobbledygook I came out with before. And one of the difficulties of studying the slave rebellion is that the sources are not great. They're better than they are for some aspects of ancient history, but obviously, apart from the usual caveat, we never get the slave side of the story. We never get Spartacus' version of events. The same problem we have with virtually every conflict the Romans fight, the other side doesn't get to tell their story. So we see things from a Roman perspective. Here they're fairly limited. The two main accounts are Plutarch in his life of Crassus. So it's not that he's focusing primarily on the slave rebellion, it's simply that the subject of his biography, in this case Marcus Licinius Crassus, this was where he makes his name to get to the consulship, gets given an ovation, novatio. It's a major part of his career, but it's still, section 8 to section 11, chapters within the wider book. There's more, for instance, on the Carrhae campaign, where Crassus goes out and gets defeated by the Parthians and gets killed, than there is about Spartacus, partly because Crassus was only involved in the last stage of the war. But there is a reasonable narrative, some background as to what's going on before. You then have Appian, part of his civil wars, book 1, where he covers the slave rebellion in similar lengths. There's not a lot in it between the two, but his focus is not so primarily on what Crassus did. So there is a bit more generally about this. Both Plutarch and Appian were writing in the early part of the 2nd century AD. So they're writing not quite 2 centuries later, but getting on for it and making use of earlier sources. So those are our two narrative accounts that give a complete and moderately detailed version of what happened from the beginning to the very end. We only have fragments, sadly, of Sallust's histories, which did deal with this in books 3 and 4. Now we have the complete texts of Sallust's description of the war against Jugurtha and the Catilinarian conspiracy. Sallust was alive at the time. He was a senator under Caesar, but he gets thrown out of the Senate, accusations of corruption while he was provincial governor, this sort of thing. He clearly denies all of this and implies that he's been done down by men of much lower character than his own and all this sort of thing. There's a rather pessimistic tone to a lot of this. You can see his influence on Tacitus later on. And it's very different to Ciceronian Latin in the way it's written. But sadly, his histories, which covered the wider period in great detail, have not survived. We get these little snippets that get quoted elsewhere and this sort of thing. And we're not always sure. There are quite a few of them, and they're intriguing. Often they provide interesting details in his account of the slave rebellion, but sometimes we don't know where they fit chronologically and this sort of thing. So that is an immense loss. And more generally, if we had Sallust's histories in full, it would open up so many possibilities for understanding better the development of the Roman army in this period. And so much is going on, and you've got all the controversy about the old view of the Marian reform and all this sort of thing. But a lot that's happening around that Civil War period and afterwards as well, that tends to get neglected, and it's so easy to make assumptions about it because we don't know as much as we do about the Ciceronian period and the build-up before, during and after to Caesar's civil war and all this sort of thing. So much that goes on in the latter part of the 1st century BC is much better documented. This earlier stuff is not. Added to that, we've got snippets from elsewhere. There's bits and pieces, Orosius, Florus, mentions here, there, and everywhere, some of which are interesting, some of which you have to treat with a pinch of salt. So, for instance, when a late source describes Spartacus as using a sica, the curved sword associated with the Thracian gladiator, Thracian type of gladiator, but also with the Thracian people beforehand, is that just, well, Spartacus is a Thracian and that's a good barbaric sounding word, that's what he should have, or can we take it as reliable that actually he chose to use this particular weapon for whatever reason? The same as the comment that he was a murmillo comes later, and it might be right, it might not. That was a type of gladiator, but perhaps not. So let's talk about gladiators a little bit first. We will do more on them. I've still got several talks in the Conquered and the Proud series to do. I've just got distracted with other things, and we've got provincial government to do, we've got entertainment to do, we've got stuff about just life in the period, as well as I think have we covered the Flavians? I can't remember whether we've murdered Domitian yet in the narrative. We'll go on to Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, through to the end of the 2nd century AD. So we will at some point, but that's when I remember to get round to it. The origins of the gladiatorial games are somewhat obscure, and it's not clear that the Romans really knew how this had all got going. You obviously have competitive sports in the Greek world, some of which were pretty violent. Boxing and wrestling were much nastier, let alone the Pancration, whatever it is, the one where you could do anything apart from use weapons, but people did. The famous case, well, more than once, a man was awarded the prize as the winner, even though he'd actually died, but his opponent had conceded before that happened. But on the other hand, gladiators are taking this to another level. So it's beyond the sort of heroic fights of champions you get in Homer and this sort of thing, and some of the funeral games you'll have there. There does seem to be an association with funerals. The Romans sometimes say the Etruscans invented it. They sometimes say the Campanians invented it. Sometimes there are other versions that it's more of a Roman thing, and you never quite know. Somebody might have an idea that then can be profoundly changed by another group, even though they still think that the origins lie back with, well, that's what the Etruscans did, or that's what the Campanians did, or whatever it might be. We first really hear of it in a Roman context, 3rd century BC, at the time of the Second Punic War, where at the funeral of famous men you start to get several matched pairs fighting. Whether to the death or not is not entirely clear. Sometimes later on it is stated, but there's at least a risk of that, a risk of serious wounding or death. Whether their death was expected and it was some form of sacrifice to the sort of spirit of the departed, this type of thing, we don't know. Many of these things are possible, even likely, but there is not enough information to be sure what's going on. And when you see from the Etruscan tombs, sort of these named fighters fighting, are they heroes? Is this some sort of funeral games thing? Very hard to say. Gradually, over the course of the 2nd century BC, the numbers involved increase, and you get bigger and bigger festivals. It's like everything else. When the aristocracy starts competing, then you tend to escalate, whether it's the scale of a triumph, whether it's the size and splendor of your house, of your estates, of your country villa, how you dress, how you act, how you lavish entertainments on people in the forms of feasts and all this sort of thing. Throughout the 1st century BC, and at this time, you only stage these games, however, in connection with the funeral. Now, a little bit later than this, Caesar will, for instance, while edile, decide to stage gladiatorial games to honour his father, who's died a long time before. Normally, it seems to be assumed that this would be fairly close, part of the sort of funeral memorial commemorations that you have, rather than backdated, as it were. So, oh, well, I had this. So they're clearly very popular. Campania seems to be an area where the sport is particularly popular, and it is. You do have to think of it as a sport. However appalling it may seem to us, that's clearly how the Romans considered it, and it isn't just about blood and guts. So that's obviously part of it. Campania, you get the first permanent amphitheatres. You've got the one at Pompeii is probably the earliest, or one of the earliest, certainly the earliest I can see today. Again, you've got to be a little bit careful saying anything is the first, because something else might turn up. When games are staged at Rome and in many other places as well, you set up a temporary arena or temporary stands. Going back, that was one nice thing they did in the HBO Rome series, where they had the gladiator fight and executions in this sort of, they showed this, it wasn't an amphitheatre, it was just temporary seating. And that's, you have the case where Curio, who becomes one of Caesar's supporters after Caesar's paid him a lot of money, he puts on games and designs, or has designed, this two semicircular sort of stands that can be spun and moved, rotated apart so that they work as theatres, or they can be brought together into the classic amphitheatre shape or something much like it, the oval shape we know so well for gladiatorial games. Not entirely sure how well it worked, but nevertheless that was the idea behind it all. It was the novelty of it. Again, you can be spectacular in the scale of something you show off, the number of gladiators you display, or you can be spectacular in the setting. Caesar, for instance, in his games as Aedile, not only displayed lots of pairs of men fighting, but also they had silver inlay on their equipment, on their helmets, armour, this sort of thing. So gladiators become very, very popular. Campania is a place where there's not just a lot of gladiatorial fights, but a lot of the ludi. The gladiatorial schools become established, and they'll obviously feature in our story. So it's big business down here. And from the numbers involved simply in the Spartacus incident, these schools can become very, very big. So we know more about how it all worked later on, and things may have been a little bit different in the early days. You get hints of this, but you can't be quite sure. So some of the things we think of as a definite rule, this is how gladiators were run, how they did things later on, like the grades of different levels from the primus paulus, the first post for your sort of most expensive, most prestigious type of gladiator. Down to different grades to the referees with their staffs, the regulator. That sort of thing is probably always there. The types of gladiator, the retiarius, the netman with his trident, that seems to be a later invention. In spite of the fact that it's going to crop up again and again, it's in the Spartacus movie, it's in the TV series, it's what we think of as a classic gladiator. There's no evidence for it until really the Augustan period. It does seem to be a later invention. Earlier on, you have the Thracian, you have the Murmillo, the heavy gladiator, you have the Samnite, another heavy-ish gladiator, you have a Gaul, you have the Eques, the mounted gladiator, who appears at this time as well. You also have a chariot gladiator, sometimes chariot-born, Esidarius. How often those ones, because obviously when you're bringing horses in, you need a bit more space than the relatively small arena area needed men fight. There's no real evidence early on for massed fights, the sort beloved of Hollywood. It's always a pair of gladiators. And there seemed to be an emphasis on who they were, their record beforehand, a lot of ceremony involving it all, and not necessarily a fight to the death. You could win on points, you could both be declared to have fought honourably and allowed to go, you could fight cravenly, in which case you might be executed. So that you'll find this later on as well. You get gladiators listed, they've fought so many fights, they've won so many. You don't necessarily win them all, and you don't necessarily die if you lose. One of the things Caesar did in preparation for his games and later on was buy up gladiators who'd lost fights and then give them extra training. So again, the fact that he could do this in considerable quantities emphasizes that the odds are you probably wouldn't die in most of these fights, that relatively few, a minority, ended in death. You could sometimes, there were games that were declared where it was to the death, but those seem to have been unusual, exceptional, and how people viewed them is less clear, whether it was seen as cruel or not. So there's an element where, as I say, Caesar can pick up these people. By the time of the Civil War, by 49 BC, Caesar owns thousands of gladiators in various schools in the area of around Capua, Campania, that sort of area, because they are seen by his opponents as potential source of fighting manpower for the Civil War. So they're not executed or anything, they're not chained up, they are broken up into smaller groups and dispersed into other people's houses and all this sort of thing, and they're watched more closely. But that gives you an idea of the scale of this all, that a few decades on from this great rebellion, not only does the fact that this slave rebellion led by gladiators, even though it scared the living daylights of the Romans, it hasn't led to a major suppression of the gladiatorial games. In fact, they're still thriving and exceptionally popular. So you have these ludi, these schools that train them, and then in most cases, as far as we can tell, a school would provide all the gladiators for particular games, so that you would be fighting as a gladiator against people you trained with and probably knew. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go easy on each other. It does mean you've got a fair idea of what they're like. There is certainly, it's the same way you can go to Rome today, you can see one of the practice arenas near the Colosseum, how there's capacity there for seating several thousands. People would go and watch in the same way you might go before a cricket match and see the players in the nets and this sort of thing. That sense of, yes, there is that sense of the desire to see the drama of a life and death struggle, the desire to see blood, the desire to see guts. The fact that later on, particularly, gladiators were probably already fairly porky at this period, but the emphasis on layers of fat later on is partly for protection, but also because it bleeds well. So it's the idea you want blood, you know, the audience wants the excitement, particularly because you look at some of the bigger amphitheatres, the further back you get, it's going to be harder to see what's going on. But whereas the odd spurt or spray of blood is going to draw attention. You can, even at this period as a gladiator, serve through, fight several fights and win your freedom, win your discharge. People do. So being sent, condemned to be a gladiator, which people can be for particular crimes, particularly slaves who've misbehaved, bandits, this sort of thing, then it's not necessarily a death sentence, though there were grades of the law that basically made that you would die by the sword at some point. But for most who end up as gladiators, there is a reasonable chance of success and survival. Not, the odds aren't in your favour, but it's not like winning the lottery. You know, it's not as long odds as that. You do get the volunteers, free men who decide to fight as gladiators. Before we get on, it's only because I think there's this, as I said, this spin-off series that seems to involve women gladiators and all this sort of thing. No evidence for that until the imperial period, and even then exceptionally rare. And they only seem to have fought other women. You've got the case under Domitian, you've got that famous tombstone from the British Museum. But it wasn't common. But it did happen, but probably not in this period. That's one of the later developments under the imperial period, and the spread of the number of different types of gladiator and all this sort of thing, and the whole setup. But there is still, even in this period, a great glamour associated with being a gladiator. And you have writers in the 1st century BC who will talk about, as later Seneca will do in the 1st century AD, that even though gladiators come from the worst type of men, you know, they're slaves, they're criminals, they're the condemned, all this sort of thing, and they are right at the bottom of the social pecking order, nevertheless they can display courage, and Cicero will talk about this, and expect his audience to understand what he was going for, the point he was trying to make. A gladiator can show courage in the face of death and can show skill. He can show virtus, this great, very Roman attribute that's far more than virtue. It's courage, it's proper behavior, it extends almost to sort of degrees of honorable behavior, that you will face danger, you will face death. And it's a little bit, you know, you'll get similar ideas for the British fondness for bare knuckle boxing in Regency England, the Napoleonic era, that you know, you can be inspired by seeing these pugs fighting, and it's the same spirit that will make you stand up to the French fleet, the French army, and this sort of thing when you're in battle. The idea that courage is something that can be admired, whoever is displaying it. and it is a good example to you. And you have the glamour of, you know, these are big tough men who go and fight, risk their lives and take life at times. You know, that's it's, the image is there, they have the glamour, they do it in this public arena in the same way the sports fan today will be obsessed by, you know, the individuals of your sport, the team you follow, this sort of thing. I mean, it's natural. We get directly involved, and so often, you know, I will find myself, my Glamorgan, the cricket team I support, my local county, talking about, oh, we've done well. That identification, it's very natural, it's very human. Unfortunately, I also support England cricket, who at the moment haven't done quite so well, but hopefully, and this, because this video is being filmed after the first test match and before the second, for the benefit, I know there are some viewers in Australia who will be able to bring these comments back to haunt me if I get it completely wrong. While I'm not desperately optimistic as to the way things are going after the loss in the first test, nevertheless, if there's any England side that could turn it around and suddenly surprise everybody by playing far better and winning, it's this one. You just never know. As a fan and a follower of England, it's amazing that all my hair hasn't gone white and fallen out yet over the last few years, because is it a bare knuckle ride watching them, following them at all. Anyway, that's my little bit about, but it hopefully, whatever your particular taste is, whatever thing you follow, you'll get some sense of the glamour associated with the individual, and particularly the ones who are the pick of it, you know, the ones who just fight with style or play with style. There are certain athletes now that are just entertainers, the way they do things, as well as being incredibly successful, and we all like that success, especially when they're on our side or they're our team. So you have the gladiatorial schools, and the majority of people there are slaves. There are a few volunteers as well, but the overwhelming majority are slaves. Let's look at Spartacus himself and what's said about him. So he's obviously the big name that comes from this, even though he isn't the only leader in the rebellion. So Spartacus is a Thracian. That much all the sources agree upon. You do get theories now and again, well, is he just a Thracian gladiator, one of these types that uses a curved sword, a high helmet, a small shield? Again, one of the things, you know, we've got the illustration at the start, the classic image of the gladiatorial helmet, the one we all think is with the face covering for most of them. Some of the earlier ones may not have had that. They probably still had the big rim around it, which offers a sort of protection but also restricts your visibility. And the high crest, which is later on, particularly when nets get involved, is something that you can get caught on that. But also, it makes it cumbersome. Gladiatorial equipment was designed to look spectacular but not to offer too much protection. So, A, it shows off your muscles, because in the main, generally speaking, your torso is more or less uncovered. You might have arm protection, you might have shoulder protection, occasionally there's some chest protection, but it's much more limited. It's not like a mail shirt that a legionary would wear who really wants to try and stay alive if he possibly can. The gladiators have got exposed, vulnerable flesh, because that's the whole point of the sport. No one wants to go and see you know, a battle where people are just clobbering away, even though you get the heavily armoured gladiators later on, I suppose, so I've just contradicted myself, but in the main, gladiatorial equipment is designed to show off their physique, but also to make them vulnerable, to make sure they are exposed to attacks from their opponent. And the helmets are designed to look great, but not actually to be very practical, to restrict your visibility, to restrict your movement. Even the shoulder guard, I mean, this was something that was brought out to me, I hadn't quite sunk in before, but in the talk at Caerleon, which I must confess I very much enjoyed. So as I say, if they run it again, if you're in the area during a school holiday and you've got kids, well worth doing it. I think they really enjoy it. Certainly my lad did. The guard you have on some of the shoulder guards with the raised piece, that can block your vision when you're sparring. And again, it's that, you know, if you've done any fencing, you know how important it is to be aware of what your opponent's doing, because it is that dueling aspect to it. And the same in any sport. You've got the thing in cricket where, yes, a protective helmet is a very good thing, but there are times when if you turn your head, you might get hit by a ball because you can't see it. You will lose track of it as you flinch. it's part of the way the sport works. There are advantages from things you get, but there are restrictions. You know, the protective gear you will have in almost any sport, it's good and it does that, but it will slow you down. It also requires training to get used to moving quickly with it. That's the whole thing. That's why gladiators, just like modern sportsmen and athletes, will train regularly, consistently, very hard. The harder they train, the better they are going to be at it. They need that natural talent, but they also need the muscle training, to get the stamina and everything else that is required, the stamina, the speed, the flexibility, this sort of thing. So gladiators are there, but as far as we can tell, Spartacus probably is a Thracian. I think most people would accept that he actually comes from one of the tribes, the peoples of Thrace, which is, a lot of it's modern-day Bulgaria, really. It's to the northeast, really, of Macedonia. Once a kingdom, now a Roman province. The Thracians had often raided Macedonia and beyond. They'd been mercenaries in the Greek world. They do the same thing in the Roman period, you know, depending on how strong or effective the governor is. Thracians will raid the provinces. You know, Cicero talks about one governor who's particularly inept, who, you know, during his tenure, the Thracians are so dominant that they're setting up camps inside the Roman province to plunder throughout the winter and all this sort of thing. I think we've talked about that in some of the raiding videos. So, what else do we know about him? The name Spartacus may be real. It does seem to have a Thracian connection. On the other hand, it might be this is a man who's been captured. He's been told, right, you're going to be a Thracian gladiator. Therefore, we'll give you a Thracian sounding name. There is, intriguingly, graffiti from Pompeii, or graffito, I suppose it is, as it's the one bit, which shows a gladiatorial fight, probably, anyway, by equites, these mounted gladiators. And it's very badly eroded, but so you might not see it too well on the picture, but it does show there's one man with a spear held underarm, chasing another man on horseback and lancing him, stabbing him in the thigh, that area. The man who has been wounded is described, his name is Spartax, which seems to be the old Oscan for Spartacus, the equivalent. Now, this date's difficult, and variously, you know, people have interpreted as saying, well, it's a typical name for a Thracian gladiator, and maybe after the famous rebellion, if you want your gladiator to have a butch-sounding name, you're going to call him Spartacus. On the other hand, there's a nice idea that it was the real Spartacus, the famous one. Maybe some have argued, though I think this is less likely, that it isn't a gladiatorial fight, that it's actually symbolic of the war and one of the battles, and maybe he got wounded in some mounted fight and all this sort of thing. I quite like the idea that it actually is a gladiatorial fight, and that maybe this was remembered. Perhaps there was even, you were saying, you know, the team I support, the school I support, or the gladiator I particularly favour, one of our lads actually wounded, defeated the famous Spartacus. Didn't kill him, obviously, because he went on to be this rebel. Or that simply something really famous happened here. Who knows? It's, as I said, we can't be sure. There's lots of possibilities with this, but it's an intriguing little glimpse of, again, the fan base, the celebration of the gladiatorial sports. It's interesting, you know, that's the case, that if it is supposed to be the famous Spartacus, that he may not always have fought as a Thracian, but also as an eques. And again, a late source does rather imply that, you know, he's great with all weapons and he can do all this sort of thing. We might also wonder, certainly later on, there does seem to be an impression that specialization is the norm, and it's very rare if a gladiator mentions that he fought in more than one style, but there are a few attested examples. Whether that was always true earlier on, who knows? Again, with so many of these things, we don't quite know. What would have been acceptable in Campania in the first quarter of the 1st century BC may not necessarily be the same as what becomes normal and fashionable later on. So, what else do we know about him? Well, Appian tells us that he'd served with the Roman army as an ally, an auxiliary, presumably with one of the armies of the governor in Macedonia, raising from local allies. One of the sources claims that he came from the Maidi, a known group within the Thracian tribes. But again, there's also the possibility that since units of Allied auxiliary troops were developing into the regular auxilia that'll be there under Augustus and are starting to appear at this point and in the decades that follow, you get Numidians, you get Cretans, you get others serving in other provinces as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if he served with the Roman army, he had to serve in a war waged by the governor of Macedonia fairly locally within his patch. That's quite possible, but he could also have gone somewhere else. People have speculated, well, you've had the big conflicts against Mithridates, you've had Sulla, his campaigns there, others associated with it. So again, Thrace is a fairly handy place to recruit people from, to go as allies, go as auxiliaries, troops there. We don't know the details, there's just that one source. It would help to explain how he seems to get and understand how the Roman army does things, because he defeats them so easily the first few times, and he moves towards a fairly regular, almost Roman pattern of the slave army. On the other hand, I've referred to this before, there is that element of Roman snobbery, that the most dangerous enemies were people we'd trained ourselves, so that's how they got so good at fighting. The Romans taught them. Earliest example is probably Jugurtha, where Sallust again emphasizes this, and it's emphasized elsewhere, that he's served at Numantia under Scipio Aemilianus, campaigns in Spain, leading presumably a contingent of men from his home country, of Numidians, because again these were superb cavalry and light infantry. The Romans, who suffered at their hands in the early stage of the Second Punic War, were very, very eager to recruit them every time after that. Later on, you'll get Arminius, of course, Civilis, Ganascus, a less famous one, Tacfarinas. There are quite a few of them. So there is that element of Roman snobbery, but in this case, again, no particular reason to disbelieve it, but we've just got to be aware of that possibility. So the odds are he's served as a soldier with the Romans. According to Florus, later source, not always reliable, he became a bandit. Latro is the Latin, which might be how he ends up getting captured, ends up being condemned as a gladiator, ends up becoming a slave, all of this sort of thing. Again, not impossible when you think those examples of the men who serve with the Roman army and then turn against us. Tacfarinas, Ganascus, they're both really described as bandits, raiders, that sort of thing. So perfectly possible, we don't know. Both Sallust and Plutarch emphasize his immense strength, his spirit, his determination, his virtues, the fighting attributes that were praised in a gladiator, that a gladiator could display. Physical strength as well. This is a formidable man. This is somebody, and you do get the hints in the sources, the little anecdotes where he does fight and lead in person and fights hand to hand himself. Again, he's a gladiator. That's what he's been training to do for some time. We don't know how long he'd been a gladiator, but years are certainly possible. It may have been a very long time. We don't know his age. We can only guess about that. Plutarch goes on and says that apart from that strength, the sort of the qualities you'd almost expect in a gladiator, he was intelligent, he was educated, more Greek than Thracian. The Greeks had always been fairly uncertain about whether the Macedonians were properly Greek, but the Thracians definitely weren't. They were savages, they were barbarians, they drank unmixed wine, they were violent, they were angry, they were sexual predators, all this sort of thing. You have the appalling massacre Thucydides talks about, where Thracian mercenaries that the Athenians have decided they don't need anymore, on their way home, raid a town, massacre everybody, including going into a school and killing all the boys there. It's seen as, Greek warfare can be pretty brutal, but there's something more extreme where the barbarians like the Thracians get involved. So that's interesting. There is this element. Yes, he's very brave. Yes, he's very strong. Also, he's very intelligent, that some sources present fairly positive view, at least of aspects of Spartacus. There are the others that condemn him as the sort of worst sort of man because he's a gladiator. Another thing you get from Plutarch is the story of a wife, a woman, his woman, who only appears when he's at Rome and already a slave being sold, and she foretells he has this great future, and there's a story of a snake sleeping on his face and all this sort of thing. Other than that, we don't ever know a name, we don't know anything about her. Has she been his woman who's been captured at the same time? And they've been almost sold as a group. Gladiators do seem to have had privileges. They were more likely to be allowed, first of all, visits for sex with women, but also to have someone who lived with them, to effectively live as a couple, live as a husband and wife. Again, the more successful you are, the more privileges you get. So the idea that he has this woman with him and she's kept with him, either that she's bought for him or that there's some prior connection, and that it's seen as, well, I want this gladiator to fight well, I want him to be motivated, therefore I will be kind to him in certain respects and be more generous to him and allow him these sorts of perks and privileges. Various sources talk about him being arrested and sold by the Romans, sold as a slave, sold as a gladiator. Varro, now this is 1st century BC, so not too long afterwards, contemporary of Cicero's and Caesar's, he talks about him being wrongfully imprisoned and innocent. So there is this tradition that shows Spartacus as somebody who shouldn't have been there, which allows actually for some of the stuff you get in the modern imaginings of the man. But beyond that, we really know very little. Now that's more than we get for many of the leaders who fight against the Romans. How much do we really know about Vercingetorix? Not a lot. You've got the Dio comment that he'd been a protege of Caesar's, had been favoured by him, rewarded by him, and then turns against him. Not mentioned by Caesar. Otherwise, all we get is, well, he tried to be king of the Averni, and his father had done the same, all this sort of thing. He's a nobleman. But then it's what he does during the campaign, but very little about who he actually is. And you could say the same about Tacfarinas, Civilis, people like this. Even ones that are on the fringes of the Roman system. We don't often get that much detail about them. So let's move on to the opening of the rebellion, the breakout from the Ludus in Capua, or near Capua in that area. Again, it's Campania as this sort of really strong gladiatorial area where there are lots of schools, lots of gladiators being trained. So the school, the Ludus of Batiatus, Vatia, Lentulus. One theory is, Barry Strauss goes with this in his book on the subject, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Vatia. I tend to like to call him Batiatus just because of Peter Ustinov in the film, and I just thought it was a fun performance. And I remember going to a talk he gave once of just one-man show that was very, very funny, very entertaining, and he talked a bit about making the Spartacus film. Why is there the breakout? Well, you could say it's pretty obvious. You're there in a gladiatorial school, you're being expected to risk your life and quite possibly die for the entertainment of people, and you're chained up, you're imprisoned. They were imprisoned. Gladiators got these privileges, but they couldn't just go home and hang up the sword and shield for the weekend and go and have family life. We're getting into horrible history's country with the the school, the gladiators bringing in their homework and all this sort of thing. The sources, such as they are, say that the regime was particularly brutal, or imply this, that they resented this, that maybe this school was more harshly run. Now, it's always difficult to tell in these situations, like mutinies in an army or any military force, prison breakouts, this sort of thing. Is it actually that this particular school is harsher, is worse than was normal, than the others that are around? Often you find within, and it's a very human thing, when you get a change, if somebody takes over or if they change the way they're doing things and say you lose what you'd had before, what you consider to be a privilege becomes perceived as a right, that can be a major source of resentment. There can be just somebody, the bit of grit in the machine that messes everything up. So you might get someone who turns nasty, you might get someone who takes over, who changes the way they're doing things, whether the trainer, whether the owner. It might be an individual thing. I mean, the idea you have in the movie, Spartacus, Spartacus is getting angry, but he only really plots to escape when Gene Simmons, Verena, or whatever she's called, gets sold off, and when he has to fight, and they do match pairs to the death in the school, which they're not supposed to do, and that's sort of breaking the rules and all this sort of thing. Other versions of it. So something happens for a spark. We are told that One source has a plan for 200 to escape. So that gives you an idea of the number of people there. Although this does seem to include from the beginning some women. The implication is that Spartacus' woman goes with him, and there may have been others as well. However, most of the sources, the probability is that 74 escape, but you do get 72 given elsewhere, or 64, or even 30 plus, depending on which source you look at. The key thing is these are the only gladiators specifically mentioned as having escaped and joining in this rebellion. Everybody else recruited subsequently are just described as slaves, and the overwhelming majority of the slave army must have been slaves. So whether there were any more gladiators joining them, they're a small percentage of the overall force. So it isn't really a gladiatorial rebellion, it is very much a slave rebellion. How it happens, again, I always think the scenes in the movie are some of the best of the whole film. The breakout, the way they turn on them, the way they drown the trainer they don't like, and all this sort of thing. And then they do seem to break out using whatever they could find from the kitchen, so skewers, cleavers, knives, this sort of thing, improvised weapons, fight their way out. There are some guards that are hired to look after, to protect the thing. They manage to fight their way out past these people. But again, not everybody gets out. So there is a breakout, some make it out, but it isn't, again, unlike Kirk Douglas, where they can sit there and they can talk about things afterwards. They don't take over the whole school and everybody gets out. It is only a proportion, fewer than half of the plan, as we can say. After they break out, according to Plutarch, they intercept a convoy, some wagons that are carrying gladiatorial equipment, presumably to another school, or quite possibly, and they take this. So that's how they move up from skewers and cleavers and kitchen utensils to gladiatorial weapons. There are then some local levies, militia, whatever they might be. It's into this vague area of the sort of armed bodies of men within Rome and Italy that we don't really get mentioned until something like this happens, and we don't really know who they are. Not regular legionaries, as far as we can tell. There's no reason for there to be a regular garrison in Capua. These then come out after them, they fight and defeat this group of soldiers, and then discard their gladiatorial weapons to take the equipment of the soldiers as less shameful. Proper military weapons are more honourable. So there's an element where early on you want to fight like proper soldiers, but also part of this may be the practical element that gladiatorial armour is designed to look good but not be as protective as it might be, whereas military gear, yes, there's an element of looking good, but it's very much designed around utility. You want this to protect you properly. So they defeat local troops and then use this regular equipment. We also get fragments where it's talked about they've sharpened stakes and hardened the points in a fire. So improvised weapons at this point. So this is 73 BC. This is when the breakout occurs. They move relatively quickly to occupy Mount Vesuvius. Now, obviously, you look at Mount Vesuvius today, and there's a big chunk out of the top from the big eruption that occurred in the 1st century AD to bury Pompeii Herculaneum. The last big one was in 1944. I've probably mentioned this before. My father was an apprentice in the Merchant Navy in the Bay of Naples when this happened. And being the apprentice, he was tasked with scraping the ash off the deck. This sort of thing. He was quite bitter about it. I also remember hearing a chap who was a subaltern in an infantry battalion at the time, and they were fighting in one of the valleys when Vesuvius erupted, and he said, well, just everything went quiet. Mankind almost gave up for a moment whilst nature was showing how it's really done when you want to do destruction. So the shape would have been different then. There probably was a dormant crater at the top. Remember, people thought this was safe. They know about Mount Etna, they know about volcanoes, but they think Vesuvius has calmed down, got that out of its system, and it's perfectly safe to live here. And it's an area of very fertile farmland, partly helped by the aftermath of earlier eruptions. So it's good soil, lots of farms, lots of this area, and you're on a mountaintop where you can make a base. So they've probably acquired some runaway slaves, some other recruits while they get there. They've done some small-scale raiding, but you're still perhaps talking hundreds, maybe 1,000 or so, relatively small numbers at the start, though it must be growing. It grows enough that the Senate in Rome decides that something needs to be done about this. It can't just be left to the city authorities of Capua, of any of these smaller communities like Pompeii, that sort of thing. So they take a praetor. Gaius Claudius Glaber is sent with a levy. Now at this stage, this is not a war, it's not a bellum, it's a tumultus, sort of a disturbance. It's a bit like that whole thing where, wasn't it, Vietnam was just declared a police action rather than a formal war, or the Falklands War. Everybody knows it was a war, people got killed, there was large-scale fighting, but it was never formally declared between Britain and Argentina. Which leads to all sorts of legal technicalities for those involved, but the practical thing was it very obviously was a war. Now, they tell Glaber he's not given told to raise a proper army. He's basically make a levy, recruit Roman citizens as you go along, get some troops, equip them, train them, sort this out. And it's the sort of thing Roman governors, Roman magistrates have to do. It's taking responsibility. It's the sort of informal side of military force that we don't hear so much about and we don't tend to think about, but is very much there, certainly in this period, less so later on as the army gets more formal and the army gets more bigger and more permanent. He goes to Vesuvius and blockades the slaves in their camp at or near the top, perhaps in this crater, whatever it might be. This is not a proper Roman army. These are levies he's picked up along the way, basically anybody willing to come, and it's probably, oh, let's go and hunt some slaves, this will be exciting. Whether this would count as a campaign of military service and therefore part of the quota, you're only obliged to do 16 campaigns at this stage before you could say, no, I'm not going to be conscripted again. That might appeal to some people thinking, well, this is an easy option and it's not far from home. He probably has a few thousand men. He does form a rudimentary camp, but it isn't anything like a proper marching camp, let alone the more improved defences that you'll get when you settle down for an area properly, that sort of thing. However, the slaves look at this and they get wild vines and they manage to scramble down using these as help one pathway that wasn't expected. So he's basically covering the main route, the obvious path, the known path, up to where the slaves are camping. They come down another side of the mountain. Somebody else is supposed to have lowered the weapons in a bundle down with the last vine. Again, they're probably heavily outnumbered by the Romans, but they attack from an unexpected direction, utterly by surprise, catch most of the Roman army asleep, army such as it is, the force there, and it's a massacre, it's a rout. The Romans either run away or they get slaughtered with very little resistance. And that's the first victory, the first proper victory. So that gives Spartacus and the rebels some more equipment, the confidence of having won, and it helps them to recruit. From then on, as far as we can tell, they're raiding the wider area. So this is an area of lots of big farms, big estates, but probably smaller farmers as well. And the estates obviously have slave labour forces that you can come in, you can recruit. So that's adding to your manpower, and people are running away to join you because there's this great problem. Well, marvellous, we can escape from slavery, from servitude, from being mistreated. Again, in general, you'd have to think, well, being a slave ain't a great deal. However, you have to balance that from your decision making point of view. What's the risk? If I go and join a group of runaways, am I going to be hunted down and executed very unpleasantly very soon? If where I am now is tolerable, it's not great, I'd prefer not to be a slave, but actually I'm reasonably well fed, I'm not arbitrarily mistreated, then maybe, I'll stay. As the slaves get more successful, more people are going to think, well, yeah, actually, I could do this. It would be wonderful, wouldn't it, to be free? Maybe this is worth the risk. Maybe there's a chance this time. And of course, in some places where you're really badly treated, you might think, first opportunity, I'm getting out of here and I'm going to join them. So the Senate decides that, well, this is a bit bigger problem than we thought, but it still doesn't really need a proper army. So this time it sends 2 more praetors. Now remember, you have 8 every year since Sulla. So you've got 8 praetors. Normally, again, since Sulla, the praetor stays in Rome for his 12 months of office and then might go out to govern a province as pro-praetor or occasionally as proconsul with bigger imperium, greater imperium, greater authority afterwards. So that's the pattern. In this case, because this is a disturbance in Italy, the Senate do not, this is almost steps out of the traditional provincial allocations. And instead, you simply take one of the year's praetors and say, well, you're not needed in Rome, you can go and do this. But actually they choose one and they think we better send another one as well. This is getting out of hand and we don't want this to be dangerous. Remember, the Senate is packed full of landowners who will own these big estates with their large slave labor forces, so they really don't want slaves to be getting any ideas about freedom and running away and rebelling. They're also friends with even more people, equestrians and others, who are also big landowners. So they are very much open to and responsive to the idea that we need to do something about this. So this time you send Publius Verinius, Lucius Cosinius. Two more praetors. None of these praetors who go out and fail have much recorded about them in other respects. This is basically their moment of fame and appearance in the sources. Verinius sends a legate ahead of him, allegedly with 3,000 men, and he's defeated, this chap called Furius, by the slaves. We don't know the details, we don't know how it happened. Once again, these are not formal armies. These men have not been given permission to go and raise legions, train them up properly. So quite how they've put together, again, it's a question of recruiting anyone who's going to volunteer, or perhaps conscripting people as you go along, saying, I'll take him, I'll take him. This is your obligation. Finding equipment for them as well as you can. We don't know anything like as much as we would like about how a legion is formed in this period. And there's another question about who legionaries are at this time, particularly in the Carrhae campaign. I'll see if I can get to that at some point, but again, the sources aren't great. I've used it before. You've got that interesting case where Catiline, a decade later, will lay out 2 legions, organize cohorts, centurions to command them, all this sort of thing, before he's got anything like enough men to make them even close to proper strength. You get that sense of how they might organize an army, but how they do that, how the contracts work to get the equipment, the supplies. Remember, the state is supplying everything now. You are not expected to turn up with your sword, your shield, your helmet, your armor, as you had in Polybius's day. But again, these are improvised levies, really, rather than it's almost like a posse in the Old West or in the movies, where you're just recruiting people, and there may be more improvisation of bring along what you've got to fight with, rather than I will supply you with this. Because how do you get this quickly? This all happens fairly fast, and it doesn't go well. They are still not treating the slaves seriously, partly because, again, nothing like this has happened before, and because deep down every Roman has to believe that a slave is beneath contempt, that a slave cannot be brave, that a slave cannot be good at fighting, that slaves will not be able to organize themselves, because that allows you to feel that it's very right and proper in this world that you are free and you are a Roman and you are wealthy, and the people you order around, the people you own, are not. They don't deserve it. That sense that being a slave, you deserve to be a slave, is a very strong one, deeply entrenched in Greco-Roman culture, which means it's very hard to accept that they can suddenly be formidable opponents. They shouldn't be. They really shouldn't be, and it's hard for you to deal with that. So Cosinius, one of the other praetors, we get a little anecdote about him. He's surprised whilst bathing in the private bathhouse of a villa not far from Pompeii, near the coast there. He escapes, with or without his clothes, but he does get away. Some of his troops do not. His army is then defeated in several engagements. In one of those subsequent engagements, he's killed. At this stage, the slaves have 3 leaders. You have Spartacus, obviously the famous one, Crixus, less famous, but the name does rather last, and it has that association, and Enomaus. This last one, Enomaus, he's killed fairly early in the fighting. We don't know when or how in any detail. We don't really know much about him. Crixus appears to be a Gaul. The other one, it's very much a slave name. It's a Greek name in origins, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything about your ethnicity. It's what your owners have chosen to call you. Verinius is still there. He's patched together survivors from his earlier defeat, the detachment there, survivors probably from Cosinius's army, and he blockades the slave army. They're still up on Vesuvius, but their camp is now rather more substantial. They're much bigger. He builds fairly big fortifications or a fairly well fortified camp, again on the main route out. And the bigger the slave army gets, the harder it will be to everybody to scramble down steep slopes using wild vine ropes, you know, to help you. Verinius blockades the slaves, but he won't attack them. Now, that's a general rule. You don't try and attack people when they're in a stronger position. That's how ancient commanders are trained, educated to behave. He clearly gets quite depressed. He writes rather despairing, plaintive letters to the Senate about how difficult his task is, how his men have lost all their spirit, they're ravaged by disease, they're deserting. Again, there's talk of the slaves ambushing them, threatening them, prancing around, showing off like warriors would, to show their contempt for the Romans. And Verinius, his army is not confident enough to attack. So they watch, and there is some skirmishing, but it doesn't go particularly well for the Romans, but they will not attack. They're hoping to blockade. And Verinius is basically saying, can somebody else, you give me reinforcements or tell me what to do or replace me? It's not his finest hour. He's not really acting as the Romans would expect one of their magistrates to do so, even if he may in fact be being entirely honest. This is a realistic assessment of the situation. But again, in a military context, you don't get rewarded for being realistic. Quite often you're seen as letting the side down, showing a lack of spirit, and you're probably going to get cashiered or sacked at the very least. One thing just to think about now, several of the sources imply that there are ethnic groups within the slave and rebel army, and that particularly you have Gauls and Germans, northern barbarians, Keltoi being the Greek, who appear and at times will break away under the leadership of somebody like Crixus. Now obviously slaves have been recruited from wherever the Romans are fighting wars, and also wherever anybody else has taken people prisoner and decides to sell them. There isn't the skin colour basis that you have with 19th century, 18th, early 19th century slavery. So you couldn't necessarily tell a slave from how they looked. There is a lot of variety, and you've obviously got Spartacus as a Thracian. The idea of Gauls and Germans, again, makes perfect sense. These were areas where the Romans have fought a lot. What's quite interesting, though, is when you start to think about, there's certainly been campaigns in the north, Transalpine Gaul, that sort of area, relatively recently. So there could be some people who've been captured as adults or as teenagers and become slaves, become possibly even amongst the gladiators, but certainly amongst the field hand population. On the other hand, the big operations against the Germans haven't happened for decades now. This is the Cimbri, the Teutones, who defeat successive Roman armies, inflict at Arausio or Orange a defeat that's ranked with Cannae for the level of slaughter, but eventually get defeated by Marius. Now, Plutarch talks about mass suicides amongst them, that the men weren't willing to be captured or sometimes were killed by their own wives for failing them, and that most of the captives were probably children or young. So if you'd been a slave and an adult and a warrior, say, in 101, the most recent of these battles, then you're pushing into middle age. It's nearly 30 years since then, by the time of this outbreak. Now that doesn't mean particularly living the life of a field hand and labourer that you're not physically very strong. So there might be some people around, some prisoners who've been captured then. There might be others who've been children. What intrigues me is the thought that there's still this perception of their identity. They may have been made slaves, but they still consider themselves as Cimbri or Sequani, whatever Gallic tribe they happen to come from. Now, whether that sense of identity, there might have been aspects of language, there might have been aspects of belief, ritual, culture that have been passed down amongst the slave community that are still surviving, or whether some of it becomes a little bit detached from the reality of tribal life. You might, in a way, almost act as more German than the real Germans do, because you're trying to have something that's yours. the situation of slavery. And it's interesting. I mean, it's just a speculation. It's simply we get these ethnic groups identified amongst the slaves. You might also find that there are some people who've just decided, perhaps because they're with slaves of that group and that's their friends, those are the ones they've worked with before, that they end up, even if they're not in any way associated with the Gauls or the Germans, that those have become their family, their group, and that's who they stay with. Anyway, Verinius has blockaded the slave army. However, the slaves sell him a dummy, basically. They take corpses and fasten them up to the rampart of their camp, their position. They've also fortified their position. They put up straw dummies. They blow trumpet calls, and then they retreat and escape during the night under cover of darkness. So while the Romans are watching them, it shows how timid the Romans have gotten, how they basically become dominated mentally by the people they're supposedly blockading. They sneak away, get down the side of Vesuvius, get into open country. It takes a long time before Verinius and his men realise that something's not right. And one of the things that warns them is that nobody's coming out to taunt them or gesture at them. And only then do they go close enough to see that what look like sentries are actually dead bodies or straw men, this sort of thing. So those sorts of deceptions are common enough, particularly the use of straw men. You get it in the 17th century. They'd often leave a burning match cord as well to suggest that musketeers were still in position. It's a deception, and it's interesting. Another thing that shows this favourable memory of Spartacus, certainly admiring, is that several of the things he does, several of the tricks he plays, appear in Frontinus' collections of stratagems written in the late 1st century AD by a Roman commander, Frontinus, man who'd completed the Roman conquest of the area where I live, South Wales, as well as organising the repair and improvement of the water supply and sewage system of Rome and all this sort of thing. So that Spartacus can be included along with the likes of Hannibal. There are Roman enemies that feature in these admired stratagems, things that it would be worth the general knowing about because they're the sort of thing that he could copy, or at least give him the right mindset of how to outwit his enemy. Verinius eventually works out what's gone wrong, but by this time the slaves are well away. He follows them, but very timidly, very cautiously for some time, and it's only later that, whether he gets closer or they decide they want to fight him, there is a battle, he is defeated. So the only other Roman force in the field has gone. We're dealing now with the autumn of 73 into the winter of 72, and the Senate have decided that clearly sending praetors with emergency levies hasn't worked. They've sent 3 of them and it's gone badly wrong. And incidentally, that disrupts the traditional system for choosing provincial governors. So we might mention him again later on. Verres, the governor of Sicily, who is later prosecuted by Cicero and goes into exile for having bled the province dry and being cruel and executed Roman citizens and all this sort of, all the things he shouldn't be doing. He gets 3 years in office. Now, one of the reasons he might do that is 3 of the praetors that of this year, 73, this is when Verres has started his term of office there in Sicily. So he's been praetor before. One's dead. 2 are utterly discredited, so you're not going to give them a province. So it sort of disrupts the system and allows something like Verres benefits from this. He gets to stay there longer and squeeze more money. So the Senate decides to send 2 of the consuls elect for 72. Well, the 2, because obviously there are only 2. Lucius Gallius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. Now, for Clodianus, and that shows that he'd been a Clodius who's been adopted by the Cornelii Lentuli, a more established family. In the way you get these adoptions that keep the line going when you don't have a son who survives to adulthood and is considered fit for public office. We don't know when he'd been praetor. Again, Sulla has not long ago regulated with the Lex Vilia Annalis the whole formal public career and given a very clear indication of the minimum age you need to be to stand for any of these offices. So normally you were 39 for praetor, 42 for consul. He's presumably been praetor then sometime before 75 BC, but we don't really know. His colleague is even more interesting because Publicola appears to have been praetor in 94 BC. So that makes him a very elderly consul. That's pushing, to his high 50s by this time, which shows that, maybe there'd been something wrong with his career. He hadn't been too popular, too successful, but this is his moment. He's suddenly got it now. That might be wrong. You've got to be a little bit careful. We don't always have all the details we would like about people's careers, but if so, that's interesting that this is somebody who is not perceived as a high flyer, shall we say. But he happens to be consul for 72 BC. The Senate's still thinking, well, yes, it's gone badly wrong, but these are just slaves. This shouldn't be a serious thing. However, we better show them some respect. Let's form proper armies and send the consuls in charge. So each of them gets an army of 2 legions. Now that's a bit less probably than the traditional consular army of 2 legions plus 2 ally of Latin and other Italian allies, because bear in mind again, since the Social War, everybody's been given pretty much citizenship south of the River Po, so that you don't have that distinction. So the equivalent would actually be a 4 legion army for a consul, but they don't always get that. So these, however, are raised by the full levy, the dilectus. They're recruited properly, they're organized properly, they have the prestige of consuls being in charge, and some elected tribunes. They are probably the legions numbered 1 to 4. That was traditional for the consuls. Bear in mind, there's a lot going on for the Romans at this time. You've had the war with Sertorius in Spain, puttering on for a long time, and it's coming to its end now. Sertorius is murdered around about this time by one of his own men who's been bribed, and that will then lead to the eventual success of the forces sent by the Senate. Pompey being one of the key commanders there, but you've also got Metellus there too. You've got Mithridates still fighting in the east at the moment. Lucius Lucullus is out there as the main commander, but there are other supporting commanders. His brother Marcus Lucullus is in Macedonia, Thrace, campaigning in that area. So there are major commitments elsewhere. This is a time when perhaps your best and brightest of your officers, your professional leaders, who seem to be the bedrock of the army at this period, and perhaps more generally, you might not find too many of these people available. And these are troops that are raised from scratch, formed into legions, begin their training, begin the process of disciplining them to turn them into a proper Roman legion, but their first combats, their first encounters will be against the slave army. Quite often in this period, you find troops already in a province that have some experience, as Caesar will do when he gets to Gaul in 58 BC. One interesting anecdote is that Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, famous as the stern opponent of Caesar, served as a volunteer at this time because his older brother had been appointed, I think, as tribune. Plutarch mentioned this. So again, it's where you get an anecdote in a life of somebody else, in this case Cato, tells us that he's there as well. So the Romans are taking things more seriously. The Senate is forming 2 proper armies under the consuls and sending them against the slaves. However, they can't do that quickly. So the rebel army pretty much is given free rein in southern Italy over this winter period, over the course of 5-6 months or so. Autumn, winter, 73 to 72. They are starting to organize themselves, and you get some of the themes you'll get throughout, of Spartacus in particular being credited with the ability to organize, thinking about things like supply. How do I feed all these people? How do I get them weapons, armor, things with which to fight? How do we move around and do all of this? How do we find our way with going on? So there is a sense they are turning themselves into a proper army, at least to a degree. And that organization's remarkable. It probably helps that you've got rural slaves as your main recruits, and they are used to working as teams. One of the leaders in one of the first slave rebellions in Sicily, the 2 that occurred there, at least one is mentioned as a villicus, this, the slave steward, the manager basically of an estate, because he's used to doing things like this. And that probably helps. And when you start to move further south, you come into the area of the big ranches, almost the cattle raising countries. Again, these herdsmen, cowboys, if you will. They're not perhaps going to be producing battle cavalry that will be useful as scouts. They're also pretty independently minded. Now, it may be quite difficult integrating all of these different groups who don't know each other into one army. And again, it suggests remarkable talent on the part of Spartacus and probably some of the other leaders, that we get talk of how there was tight control on distribution of plunder, so that Spartacus doesn't want just gold and riches unless you can buy something with them. He's more interested in getting equipment, food, obviously, weapons, all the things we can use to make weapons. And you do have lots of craftsmen, again, amongst the slaves you've got there. There does seem to be some debate, the first instance of this, of where they should go, but eventually they decide to move south rather than north. They go through Campania, they go to Lucania, that's sort of the heel of Italy, that area there. Along the way, some things turn nasty. So there is a particularly brutal sack of a place called Forum Anni, moderately large, but not defended. It's not a city with walls. This is sacked. There's talk of atrocities, of rape, of all this sort of thing. Now, obviously, again, this is an army of slaves. Having been slaves means they have had a really terrible time. They have been treated badly. They've been treated as property, as things, forced to do whatever their owners, their masters tell them what to do, however degrading, unpleasant that might be. And some of those masters, human nature being what it is, will have been particularly brutal, particularly vicious, will have abused them physically, sexually, mentally, all of these things. There are plenty of people in this army with very good reasons to hate Romans, to hate owners, to hate free people. Some worse than others. It depends what sort of experience you've had. That will vary a lot. Plutarch and Appian both rather imply that early on, atrocities are actually comparatively rare. But this happens, and this settlement is sacked, and the population suffer very badly at the hands of them. Later on, you will get some more blanket statements by later authors that this is what the slaves always do. They murder, they rape, they torture, all of this sort of thing. But on the other hand, there's some impression that, in part because you're sticking with the countryside, you're not going into towns and cities because most of the big ones have walls, you don't want to try a siege. You don't have the capacity, you don't want to try and do it. And anyway, if you get in there, the slaves you recruit are probably less hardy than the rural slaves that you can find in the countryside. If you move around the countryside, most of the free citizens, if they get warning, can probably escape and get away. So there's not too many people out there to be vulnerable to this sort of thing as well. Later they occupy Thurii, that's the first major settlement. They go to Metapontum, they do some damage there. They rest for the winter, they build up the army. So the army is increasing in size, it's becoming more organized. We don't have reliable numbers, but you are probably already talking tens of thousands. What proportion of that are fighting men and what proportion of those are properly equipped and have some form of training? Again, harder to say. But it is growing. The slave army is getting bigger and it moves along. It's like a snowball. It keeps building up more and more people. You come to an area and the slaves join you. Because again, the more successful you seem, the more they're going to think, well, actually, this is really worth it. This might be my chance. I can be free and I can survive. And I'm not necessarily going to be caught by the slave catchers and returned straight away to servitude. I'm probably worse than I've had before and punished and all this sort of thing. So we come into spring of 72 and the summer. The consuls don't leave Rome until this time. So the armies that are being formed are probably in or, well, near Rome rather than in it. But we do know they passed some legislation. So there are restrictions. Verres has already been getting up to some things that are causing comment back in Rome. And there is some restriction on what governors can do that seem to be aimed at him, passed at this time. And there are other details. So again, the Sullan system had been based on the idea that consuls, like other magistrates and praetors, would spend 12 months in Rome doing stuff that was required by the state. Committing the two consuls in their year of office to a campaign means that they're not going to be able to do quite so much, but they do something. The rebels head north, and they seem to be heading towards the north of Italy, and there does seem to be this idea that Spartacus certainly advocates, maybe he's the man who inspires it all together, that actually we've got a big army now, let's fight our way out of Italy, fight our way over the Alps, and then go home. Escape, go back to our homelands, our various homelands. Both Roman armies get defeated, but there's a dispute amongst the rebel commanders over, well, actually, I don't want to leave Italy, I'd like to stay here. And Crixus separates off with a large part that are seen as northerners, Gauls, Germans primarily, but again, it might be, as we've said, more complicated than that. He gets defeated and killed along with most of his men, but Spartacus then defeats the Romans again, their combined forces, and the consuls are recalled by a decree of the Senate. This we're told by both Sallust and Livy. It's not there in Plutarch and Appian, who are less concerned with the way the Romans do things. So basically, we've sent 2 consuls, and they've made a pig's breakfast of the whole thing. It hasn't worked. The slaves have won even greater victories. Each time they've done so, they're more confident. More people join them, and they've got more equipment. And our soldiers are that much more dismayed at the prospect of facing this slave army. Spartacus gets as far as Mutina in Cisalpine Gaul with the combined force, and he defeats the local governor, a former praetor, up there, but then turns around and goes south. And we have to ask the question of why, because he does seem to be on the verge now of getting out of Italy, of crossing the Alps, getting away. Now, there are still Roman armies north of the Alps. You've got stuff in Transalpine Gaul, there might be some stuff in Illyria, there probably is. So you're not necessarily home free. And of course, from a practical point of view, he's from Thrace, others are from Gaul, maybe there are Spaniards, people from the Iberian Peninsula, maybe there are Numidians, maybe there are Asians. There probably is a wide mix of people. How do you safely get all of those people back home? Are there enough groups for them to go off where they're not just going to get captured by a local tribe and turned into slaves or there? So that's probably one problem. We're also going to come back to this idea that, particularly when you have groups like Germans and Gauls, many of these people may have been slaves since they were children or even born slaves. And there will be a substantial proportion of the slave army that were born in Italy. A little bit later, under Augustus, he gives a gift of an Italian slave to the King of Kings of Parthia. Story for another day. What does that mean? Presumably not ethnically Italian by that time, but a slave born in Italy. So some people may have had a home to go to, and perhaps somebody like Spartacus, who does seem to have been a free man in Thrace, who served as an auxiliary with the Roman troops, Roman army, he's probably got a concept of home that is lacking to many of his followers. So for whatever reason, either they decide that it just isn't practical, we can't do this, or people say, actually, I'm happier in Italy, this is where I can plunder, and we keep beating these Roman armies, why do we need to run? We can defeat them. For whatever reason, and it might well be that he simply can't control his men or can't convince them, because again, you've got this pattern. Yes, this is becoming an organized army, but it isn't under tight military discipline. This is still a band, and the way Spartacus is depicted as acting, in many respects, suggests more a chieftain amongst one of the tribal peoples, rather than a Roman general, a proconsul in charge of an army. So we come into the autumn of 72, that winter that'll lead us to the spring of 71. The Senate at this point give command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a former praetor who's 43, 44 by this time. So one thing to note, he's a couple of years past the time he could stand for the consulship, but he hasn't done so, or if he has done so, he hasn't succeeded at this point. Crassus has done really, really well under Sulla. He'd been a hunted fugitive. His father and his brother are both executed by supporters of Marius and Cinna, people like that in the Civil War. He hides in a cave at one point, eventually comes back, joins Sulla, becomes one of his senior subordinates, even though at this stage, he's, I suppose, in his 30s by this time, so he is more, he's certainly a more serious figure than Pompey, in the sense that he's old enough to be considered important by the Romans. Pompey's there because he's recruited his own army, and he's quite good at using it, and also you don't want him to join the other side. So In the Battle of the Colline Gates outside Rome, he has commanded one wing of Sulla's army, and he's done a lot to contribute to the victory there. So he's done very well out of it. He's been rewarded financially by Sulla. He's then been busy in the courts. He's been busy as a property developer in Rome, around Rome. Crassus has made himself a rich man and an important man. He's supposed to have joked that, you know, you can't consider yourself rich till you can afford to raise your own legion, which of course is something Pompey's already done by this stage from his family estates. Why he's chosen, he has this military experience of the Civil War, but we don't know of anything after that. He doesn't seem to have gone out to a province after his praetorship, presumably through choice. And he's around, he's available, and it's a logical thing. So now you're effectively taking, as the Sulla model should be, one of your former magistrates, giving them a task, a military responsibility, a province effectively, even though it's within Italy. He goes to the army, he recruits more troops, and he also trains the ones that are already there very hard as well, make sure they're properly equipped, very tightly disciplined. Because of a defeat that occurs around about this time, perhaps before he takes over, perhaps early on, perhaps a mix of both, he carries out the traditional, as it's described, punishment of decimation. On, some people would say only one cohort, some would say several cohorts, some would say legions. The sources are rather vague. It might be 40, 50 men who die, it might be 400, 500. We don't really know. It might be anything in between. There aren't many historical cases that are firmly attested of this punishment of decimation. And I won't do a full rant because I don't know whether I've done this before or not, but it really bugs me when the term is used, you know, a division of the army was decimated by historians writing about more modern periods, or journalists will do it all the time now. Decimation means the execution of 10%, 1 man in 10, picked out by lot, then beaten to death by his comrades. Now that's appalling. You know, 1 in 10 is terrible, and this is a very savage group punishment. But it tends to be used in a way that implies 90% have gone. That seems to be the implication. Being decimated means that you're effectively destroyed as a unit, or as an institution. You know, this education system has been decimated or whatever by, or this civil service department, whatever it might be. It doesn't mean that. It is a terrible punishment, but it is 10%, not 90% that suffer. The 90% who survive are given symbolic humiliations. You know, they're fed barley rather than wheat, they camp outside the rampart, this sort of thing. There is a pattern of tight discipline under certain commanders, and you can see Crassus' motivation in that these are troops who've got beaten again and again and again, and you need to convince them to be more frightened of you than they are of the enemy, but also then you've got to try and convince them, well, you can win, and you will win, because we're going to do things properly this time. So you have this retraining of the army. Spartacus is down south, Crassus follows him, shadows him, isn't a big battle early on. Spartacus has some negotiation with the pirates that again are rampant in the Mediterranean. Remember, this is a few years before Pompey will be given his command in 67 BC to go and suppress the menace. This is the time when Caesar has been held for ransom, taken by where they've even sometimes raided the shores of Italy and arrested, kidnapped praetors and this sort of thing, and noble folk. However, it fails to lead to anything of either any form of alliance, let alone lifting the army off. And bear in mind, the army has got very big by now, even after Crixus' defeat and the losses there. He also goes to the Straits of Messina, tries to build rafts and get across to Sicily. Now, Sicily is a tempting target because A, there have been slave rebellions there before, and B, it's a very big producer of wheat and other crops. It's a great place to feed yourself, it's wealthy, and it's a bit more isolated, might be easier to defend. But it proves impractical. Verres, the governor prosecuted by Cicero, will claim that, he's done a lot to defend the shores against Spartacus. It looks as if most of it is actually the difficulty of making enough rafts and making them well enough by slaves who don't necessarily know much about the sea or boats, but also the actions of Crassus's army harassing them. So this fails. Crassus fences off, basically blockades Spartacus in the toe of Italy. And there is some early fighting. There is a minor defeat suffered by some of Crassus's men, and that might be associated with the decimation. But he is then blockaded. Now, it's probably not one ditch, wall, rampart with towers continuously, because there are some areas of very rocky, impassable hills. So it's probably cutting off the routes through the valleys to box the slave army in. At the same time, the Senate decides that things are not happening fast enough. Crassus hasn't solved the problem. They recall Pompey from Spain. Sertorius is dead by now, the war is over, so Pompey's due to return anyway. They also recall Marcus Lucullus from Macedonia, Thrace, where he's been campaigning with his army. One version is that you get in Plutarch that Crassus actually writes to the Senate asking them to do this. And there's the intriguing idea that I think Barry Strauss plays with, that if he's heard that Pompey is going to be recalled, then if he sends a request to request not just Pompey but Lucullus, it A, shows that he is a man who is putting the good of the state before his personal interests and his personal glory, but also if you're recalling Lucullus and Pompey, then Pompey becomes less important. Who knows? I mean, it's a nice idea. So Crassus has boxed them in the toe of Italy. One nice possibility, and it is no more than that, is that we know that Julius Caesar was elected as military tribune for this year, round about now, probably in 71 BC. Nothing is mentioned apart from the fact that he was elected as one of the 24 tribunes who were still elected rather than appointed, and they're the men normally, or traditionally, they were given to the first 4 legions and the consuls. Whether that works that way this time or not is unclear. No overseas service is mentioned for him, which makes it likely, I think, that he served as tribune in the war against the slaves and under Crassus. And that might be, if not the start, at least an important stage in the relationship the two men will develop, where Crassus will financially back Caesar in his career. We don't know any more than that. You know, again, in the Spartacus TV series, he was sort of a spy and espionage, and that, you know, involved in all sorts of things. Who knows? We don't know what he was doing. It is interesting that in Book 1 of the Gallic Wars, he does refer to, when he's trying to encourage his men, when they're a bit worried about fighting the Germans, he says that, well, we fought them in the slave army not too long ago and we hammered them then. He doesn't say, I was there and fought them, but it's interesting that that's included. So it's maybe a hint that he had direct experience, that people would know he was involved in that war as well. So they're boxed in. Spartacus men, it's basically Crassus is kicking the enemy in the stomach, letting starvation do his work for him, or forcing the slaves to butt heads against his well-fortified line where they can be shot down by missiles and he can bleed them dry. However, Spartacus breaks out. There are several versions as to quite how he does this. You have one story of him bridging the ditch outside the Roman fortification line with corpses, perhaps with other material as well, something that appears elsewhere in a Thracian context. He attacks in a snowstorm, he does a diversionary attack, and however it happens, some of the army, at least some of it, breaks through the Roman defensive line and gets out, and it's quite possible then the rest joins him. You know, one source has only some getting out at first. However, you have to think that once the line has been broken, then it's no longer really functioning. Therefore, Crassus pulls out, the rest of the slave army joins them. Crassus pursues them. You then have yet another dispute within the slave army, and this time Castus and Gannicus, or Canicus, again, Germans, Gauls, this sort of thing, break off with a group of northerners and want to go their own way, want to plunder, won't obey Spartacus. Crassus surrounds them. Spartacus comes up to reinforce but can't quite join up with them. They are destroyed. They fight to the last and are wiped out. This is the story you have where the Romans, Crassus puts troops in hiding on high, probably wooded ground above the position, the camp of the slave army. They're about to launch a surprise attack. They're seen by 2 women who are off possibly something to do with the menstrual cycle, possibly some religious ritual thing, whatever. They see them, the slaves get warnings, that ambush doesn't work, but in later fighting, perhaps over several days, they are defeated and destroyed. Spartacus is unable to join them, certainly unable to save them, may suffer a minor defeat himself. He retreats towards Brundisium, away from this, so down again towards the ankle, I suppose, of Italy. Big port there, but this is a big port city, and Lucullus has brought back his army from Macedonia and arrives, so they can't go that way. They are then being pursued by a detachment, an advance guard of Crassus's men. They turn on this and defeat them. And that seems to inspire everybody with the thought that, hey, wow, aren't we strong? The Romans are terrified of us. It's back to the good old days. Let's just slaughter this army. So then the army turns about against Spartacus' wishes, apparently, and marches towards Rome itself. And it gets to within about 40 miles. It goes a long way. Now, they're not going to take the city, but nevertheless, they can certainly scare people. But it's that sense of, let's get some revenge, let's get some plunder, let's show these so-and-sos that they can't treat us as badly as they have while we've been slaves. You get the final battle. Now, as with all these battles, it would be wonderful to know just how they occur. Are they, as Barry Strauss, for instance, and others suggest, ambushes? Spartacus fighting like a Thracian, fighting like a brigand, luring the Romans into ambush, destroying them. Quite possibly, but we don't know enough about all of them. The last battle does appear to be more of a stand-up fight, but the details are very meagre. It may well start by accident, whilst outposts, people digging forward in trench positions, start to clash with each other. Perhaps they want to seize the same bit of ground, and it escalates as more and more people come out, and eventually the two armies come out, deploy facing each other. So there's a delay. It doesn't go straight into a battle, and then they fight with Spartacus attacking. This is when you have the story of Spartacus bringing out the horse that's been captured from one of the Roman commanders in the previous campaigns, and then in front of his army he slits the horse's throat and kills it. Maybe a sacrifice, you could see it that way, but the boast is that, well, I don't need this, I'll get a better one later in the day. But also it's the clear promise, I will stay with you, I will fight with you, I will share every risk you share. Caesar, in his first battle in Gaul, the one against the Helvetii, has his horse sent away. Makes a great demonstration of this to prove to the men, I will stay and fight. Marius does something similar in the first battle against the Cimbrian Teutones. So it's a powerful gesture, but it also means that he's then going to fight this battle as a warrior, as a leader, rather than as a battlefield manager galloping around trying to sort of plug things. And it does seem, the impression you get from the sources is that basically the slaves are going to fling themselves at the hated Romans and try to destroy them. It doesn't appear to be a desperately subtle battle. Other than that, we don't know much. Spartacus is supposed to have headed for Crassus. Going for him again, that's fitting perhaps for a chieftain of the Maedi, of these Thracian warriors, perhaps also for a gladiator, thinking, well, you're my opponent, I'm going for you. The story is you have of two centurions coming across him, attacking him at the same time, trying to block him, and he kills both of them. Later, he can't get to Crassus, he starts to take wounds, he's gradually worn down. Very many of his men stand and fight to the death. Whether they are shot down by missiles from a distance, whether they're hacked down by the Romans, who knows. But it's a brutal battle, hard fought, but the slaves are decisively defeated. And the bulk of them are killed, but there are at least 6,000 prisoners taken. And these will be crucified along the road from Rome to Capua. Now again, traditionally most people have said, well, it's probably the Appian Way, could be the Via Latina, it depends really. It is this appalling example. There's no good reason to believe that there aren't something like 6,000 slaves executed in this manner, left to die slowly, as the sort of their own weight basically kills them. And you have that dramatic scene at the end of the movie. It is one of those things. It is meant to be appalling, to be terrifying. And I mean, perhaps the best way of showing how effective that is that I can't remember when I first heard that story, but I think I was quite young, and it may even have been seeing the film and then reading that it was true. Once you hear about it, you're never going to forget that. And that's even now. So think of the message that gives to the poor devils in slavery then and subsequently, that this is what is going to happen. Rome will win in the end, and you will die an agonizing death. Now, it is one of the reasons, they do other things as well to try and better control the slave population, but it is one of the reasons why there isn't a repeat of the Spartacus rebellion on anything like this scale in Roman Italy. And rarely do you get anything like this in the provinces either. There are some outbreaks, but it's very limited. Pompey mops up a section of the rebel army, about a few thousand men, and claims that he finished the war in that sort of rather mean-spirited fashion that he has, when, frankly, he's not a man who has much to prove. He's already won big successes on his own. You really feel he could leave this to others, but he doesn't. He, however, and Crassus will both stand for election to the consulship for 70 and will win. Pompey gets a triumph for his war in Spain, which, given that he's been fighting against Sertorius, a fellow Roman, is slightly iffy, but they present it as against the peoples of the area rather than against it. Crassus gets an ovation, so this is a lesser triumph. Rather than riding in a chariot, he rides on horseback. Some of the other honours are more limited, and this is explained because his opponent was not considered worthy of a proper triumph. Now, given the losses that Spartacus and the rebels have inflicted on the Romans, you can't help thinking this is deeply unfair, but it comes back to this idea that the Romans don't want to accept that slaves could be dangerous. And once the threat is over, once the panic is over, you can minimize it. And you can reassure yourselves by saying, well, they're just slaves. Slaves are slavish by nature, cowardly, craven, lacking in spirit, lacking in skill. Yes, it was, got out of hand a bit, but Crassus has sorted out. But it isn't like a big war against Gauls or Celtiberians or Mithridates or anybody like that. There are still a few slave rebels around, supposedly in 60 BC, for the father of Augustus, Marcus Octavius, as praetor to kill or arrest. Again, big forces like this, some people have scattered, some people escape, and there might well be a few, but essentially there are no major forces around disrupting Italy in a big way. They've just joined the ranks of other bandits, outlaws that are there in the countryside, hard to control, but not really a major problem. So that's the end of the story. Spartacus has died in battle. You don't get the whole Kirk Douglas, I'm Spartacus stuff. Great cinema, no basis for it in history. And again, you come back to our problem at the start with sources, is there's so much more we'd love to know. You would like to know more about these people, about the details of the debates with Crixus and others, the disputes within the slave high command. We'd like to have far more detail of the battles, what was going on, and more about how the slaves organized themselves, who they were. This is, again, you're not dealing with somebody with settled areas of occupation, houses, villages, this sort of thing. So archaeologically, the chances of ever finding much connected with this army is slim. And anyway, how would it differ from the rest of the population of Italy? Material culture-wise, presumably they're dressing, they're acting, they're eating, they're using the same tableware as everybody else. So to a great extent, Spartacus remains a mystery, and all the details of this rebellion remain a mystery. I haven't gone through every little bit of detail, every little anecdote within the sources, but there isn't a great deal more than what I've said. So it gives you an idea of how problematic it is trying to understand that. But nevertheless, hopefully people have enjoyed this look at the sources, at the context of what's going on, and trying to understand this incredible story, because it is. You come back to this idea, a slave rebellion on this scale is a rare thing in human history, and to be as successful as it was for so long, even if it fails in the end, is still an incredible achievement, particularly in the Roman period, because the Romans, on the whole, they are very effective at managing slaves and doing this. So whoever he was and whatever he was like, Spartacus was a pretty remarkable man, as were some of the other leaders. And it would be fascinating to know more about him. But unless we're lucky enough and the rest of Sallust's text emerges somewhere, which seems unlikely, I doubt this will ever happen. So anyway, that's a look at the history behind all the stories, the films and the like, and the novels about Spartacus. That's the historical Spartacus, as far as we know and as far as we can push this. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.